The day we kissed, I knew it was the start of something beautiful. But it didn't start the way you might think. You see, we weren't a couple at the time, not even close. We were strangers. Well, not entirely strangers, but in the way people who share a city but never cross paths are. He was a guy I'd seen around. His presence was like a shadow that danced at the edge of my awareness, there but never quite reaching me. That day, though, it wasn't just a glance that connected us. It was something that pulled me in, something I couldn't avoid, like an invisible thread tying us together in ways neither of us could have anticipated. I still remember the moment it all flipped, how it began with a bang, not a whisper. We were at a party, crowded and loud, but somehow when the music shifted, there was a pause. A moment of stillness where everything blurred except for him and me. I could feel his eyes on me and I couldn't look away. The tension in the air was thick. Something was shifting, but the truth hadn't hit us yet. What I didn't know then was that he had been watching me for weeks, trying to figure out if I was someone he could talk to, someone he could finally be himself around. And for me, I was trapped in a spiral of confusion, locked in a cycle of self-doubt that I couldn't escape, never imagining this night would shatter all of that. Then came the storm, a cascade of emotions I didn't know how to handle. There was a fight, a chaotic mess of words and shouts, between people who were supposed to be friends. I stood there, rooted to the ground, my heart pounding, terrified. I didn't know why it was affecting me so much. I barely knew these people, but the air felt suffocating, the noise too much. I turned, seeking a way out, but that's when he stepped in front of me, his hand on my arm, firm but gentle. His face was open, his eyes locked onto mine with a kind of intensity that pulled me from the panic. "Are you okay?" he asked, and the world around us seemed to stop. It was the first time anyone had ever cared in such a direct, unguarded way. I barely had time to react before his hand brushed my cheek, soft, tender, a touch that held everything: questions, answers, an apology, a promise. And without thinking, without any plan or hesitation, I kissed him. The kiss was nothing like I had imagined, no fairy tale, no perfect Hollywood moment. It was raw, filled with urgency, like two souls colliding in a desperate, breathless plea for connection. I felt like I was falling deeper into something unknown, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid of it. I didn't know what this moment would mean, but as his lips met mine, I knew it was the start of something that could change everything. But life doesn't let things stay simple for long, does it? We parted as quickly as we came together, pulling back, eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, but his voice wasn't full of fear. It was full of wonder. The air between us crackled with energy, and for a fleeting second I thought maybe we had both found something. But then the world came rushing back. The noise, the crowd, the reality. And just like that, we were back to being strangers again. Only this time there was something unspoken between us, something that neither of us could shake. And though I walked away that night uncertain, one thing was clear. My life was never going to be the same again. That kiss, it was only the beginning. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it was just a moment, an impulsive slip, nothing more than a fleeting mistake. I tried to write it off as a product of the tension, the chaos of the party, or maybe the alcohol, even though I hadn't had nearly enough to explain how electric it felt. I avoided him. He, on the other hand, seemed to pop up in all the places I never expected. It was as if he had become a ghost, haunting the edges of my day in ways I couldn't escape. At first, I thought it was coincidence. I'd see him at the coffee shop standing just a few feet away, but he'd never approach. Then we ran into each other at the same grocery store. He smiled at me, and something in that smile said it all. He wasn't pretending like it didn't matter, and neither could I. I started to feel that pressure, that unspoken tension every time we were in the same room. I couldn't deny it anymore. His presence had this strange, magnetic pull on me, and no matter how much I tried to avoid it, I found myself gravitating toward him. The first real conversation we had came on a random Thursday afternoon, while I was sitting in a park, alone, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. It wasn't planned. In fact, I hadn't even noticed him sitting on the bench beside me until he cleared his throat. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, his voice as casual as if we were old friends, but there was something in the way his gaze lingered on me that made my heart skip. I should have said no, should have kept my distance, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, unable to form any coherent words. We talked about everything, or at least that's what it felt like. We spoke about the usual stuff, work, life. But underneath the surface, something was shifting. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't done with anyone in years. It was strange how easy it was to talk to him, as if the world around us had disappeared. We laughed about trivial things, and yet, with every word, the connection between us grew stronger. There was an unspoken understanding between us that felt safe, untainted by the complexities of the world. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had never felt this seen before, never felt like someone truly understood the parts of me I kept hidden from everyone else. The more I saw him, the more confusing everything became. My emotions were becoming tangled. Was this friendship, or was it something else? Every time our hands brushed or our eyes locked, I felt the pulse of something deeper, something more dangerous. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it, but every moment I spent with him only confirmed my worst fear. I was falling for him. And worse still, I didn't know if I was ready for it. I wasn't ready for the complications, the judgment, the fear of what people would think. Yet every time I saw him, the pull became impossible to ignore. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. And then, just when I thought I was starting to make sense of everything, the universe threw a wrench into it all. One rainy evening, I ran into him again, but this time it wasn't a coincidence. He was standing outside my apartment building, drenched from the downpour. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his hair wet and plastered to his forehead, his eyes searching mine like he was waiting for permission. For what? I couldn't tell. I couldn't stay away, he said, his voice quieter than usual, like he was unsure of his own words. The rain poured down harder, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. I didn't know how to respond. Was he really here at my door in the middle of this storm? Or was this just another twist of fate that I wasn't prepared for? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. So instead, I stepped forward, pulled him into the warmth of my apartment, and for the first time in weeks, allowed myself to stop running. The moment he stepped into my apartment, everything seemed to slow down. It was as if the world outside no longer existed, just the two of us, standing there in the quiet, surrounded by the hum of the rain hitting the windows. He wasn't just a guy anymore. He was the embodiment of everything I had tried to deny about myself, everything I had shoved down deep for years. My pulse raced as I closed the door behind him, unsure of what to do next. He turned to face me, his wet clothes clinging to him in a way that felt both vulnerable and intimate. His eyes never left mine, and for a split second I could see the fear mirrored in them. He was just as unsure as I was. "I don't know why I came here," he whispered, his voice trembling, "but I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't thinking about you." And just like that, all the walls I'd built around myself started to crumble. There was something raw and unspoken in that admission, something that stripped away all the layers of doubt and insecurity that had been holding me back. I knew then, in the deepest part of my soul, that this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a fleeting moment of confusion or impulse. It was real. And as the weight of that realization sank in, the words that had been locked inside me broke free. "I've been thinking about you too," I confessed, my voice barely audible, as though saying it out loud might somehow make it all too real. The silence between us thickened, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was pregnant with possibility, with everything we hadn't yet allowed ourselves to acknowledge. I didn't want to overthink it, didn't want to push myself into some narrative of what this could or couldn't be. Instead, I stepped closer, drawn to him like a magnet until there was no space left between us. His breath hitched as our chests brushed, and I could feel the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of our clothes. In that moment, it wasn't about labels or definitions. It wasn't about the expectations of what should come next or how this fit into the world's idea of normal. It was just us, two souls standing on the precipice of something neither of us had ever imagined. Without speaking, he cupped my face gently, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. But there was something else there too, hope. Then, as if the universe had been holding its breath, he kissed me again. This time there were no hesitations, no questions hanging in the air. It was a kiss that held everything, years of doubt, years of longing, years of pretending I wasn't capable of feeling this way. And when he pulled back, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that left me breathless. I saw it. I saw the truth that neither of us had been brave enough to face before that night. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," he whispered, and for the first time in my life, I understood what he meant. I was tired of hiding, of running from what felt right. But as the words hung in the air, the weight of them felt heavy. Because as much as we were finally being honest with ourselves, there was one truth neither of us was ready for. The world outside, the one that wasn't so kind to people like us, was still there. And that world wasn't going to make this easy. I didn't know how we were going to make it work, didn't know if we even stood a chance. But at that moment, none of that mattered. The future was uncertain, the risks were real, but what we shared right there in the quiet of my apartment was something undeniable. Something we couldn't run from anymore. He was my first real kiss, the one that made me realize I had never felt truly alive until that moment. But I also knew, with a sick twist in my gut, that the beautiful, messy truth was that we were just beginning a journey neither of us could predict. The days that followed felt like an electric current running through my veins, each second more intense than the last, but also more terrifying. Every time we spoke, I could feel the weight of the unspoken truth between us, hanging like a storm cloud ready to burst. We both knew what this was becoming, something undeniable, something so real it scared the hell out of both of us. But we also knew it wasn't going to be easy. The world, the one we'd spent our lives fitting into, would never understand. At first, we tried to be cautious. We saw each other in quiet, hidden places, as if our connection was some sort of secret that couldn't be exposed. We would meet in the early hours of the morning when the streets were still asleep, or in dimly lit corners of cafes, where the outside world couldn't see us. It felt almost perfect in those stolen moments, like we were living in a parallel universe where none of the judgments, the labels, the expectations existed. But even in those quiet moments, the reality was never far behind. One night, we met in a park near my apartment, the same place we had first sat and talked for hours. It was late. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves in the wind and the soft hum of distant traffic. We sat on the same bench, not saying much, just being there, sharing space. But as I looked at him, something shifted. The intensity in his eyes wasn't just longing anymore. It was something darker, something heavy. He turned to me, his voice strained. "We can't keep pretending this isn't real, can we?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the truth we both had been avoiding. I wanted to say something, to deny it, to protect myself from what was coming, but I couldn't. Instead, I nodded, the weight of the moment settling in my chest like a rock. It was then that I realized we were at a crossroads, a point where we could no longer go back. The secrecy, the quiet meetings in hidden places, it wasn't sustainable. We were living in a bubble, pretending the rest of the world didn't exist, but I knew we were just one wrong move away from everything exploding. And that's when it happened. The shift, the unexpected, gut-wrenching twist that neither of us had anticipated. I was walking him home that night, my heart in my throat as we talked in hushed tones about the future, when we passed by a group of people. A familiar face from my past, someone I hadn't seen in years, someone who didn't know anything about me, stopped us. He gave me a strange look, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you two doing together?" he asked, his voice dripping with judgment. Before I could respond, I saw the flash of recognition in his eyes, and just like that, I knew he understood. He knew what we were, what we had been hiding. The tension in the air was suffocating. I could feel my chest tighten, panic rising within me as I glanced at him, then back at the stranger. I wanted to run, to pretend none of this was happening, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away. The stranger's gaze shifted from me to him, lingering longer than it should have. Then, with a sharp, dismissive laugh, he muttered, "It's not worth it, you know." I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, but it wasn't the stranger's words that hurt. It was the realization that he was right. The world wasn't going to make this easy. And suddenly, the weight of it all hit me. The truth of what we had wasn't just ours. It was something bigger than us, something that could break everything we had built. But in that moment, looking into his eyes, I knew one thing for sure. No matter the cost, we weren't going to hide anymore. We were going to face whatever came next together. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind, everything spinning faster than I could catch my breath. But somehow we still held on to each other. The world, as expected, didn't make it easy. The stranger who'd confronted us that night spread whispers, seeds of doubt that blossomed into something ugly. Suddenly, it wasn't just about us. It was about everyone else, the judgment, the questions, the expectations from a world that had always tried to define what love was supposed to look like. Friends started distancing themselves, not outright rejecting us, but acting differently, their smiles tinged with a kind of pity or confusion I couldn't understand. People who had been there for me, people who I'd trusted, now looked at me like I was broken. Like we were broken. I could feel the weight of their stares, the whispers, the judgment in the air. But none of it mattered when I was with him. In those moments, the world disappeared and all that was left was us, raw, unfiltered, and real. There was a day, though, when it all became too much. I was sitting in a coffee shop, my hands trembling as I stared at my phone, reading message after message of concern from people who didn't really understand. "Are you sure about this?" one read. It's not worth it, trust me. I felt trapped, suffocated by the walls closing in on me, the weight of everyone's opinions pulling me down. I looked up, my eyes catching his across the room. He was there, just like he always was, patient, understanding, a constant. But that day, something was different. There was a quiet sadness in his expression, a weariness in the way he looked at me. I could see it, he was carrying the same burden I was. We hadn't talked about it yet, but we both knew. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about surviving the weight of everything else. And I could feel myself starting to crumble beneath it. He walked over to me, his steps slow, deliberate, like he knew I was breaking. Without a word, he sat down next to me, and I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know how. I wanted to speak, to tell him that I was scared, that I didn't know if I was strong enough to keep going. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. Instead, he reached out, taking my hand in his, and that simple touch, just the weight of his fingers on mine, was enough to make everything feel just a little less heavy. "We'll figure this out," he said softly, like it was a promise, a lifeline. And for the first time in weeks, I believed him. The road ahead was going to be tough. There were going to be days when we both wanted to run, days when the world would make us question everything we were building. But in that moment, with his hand in mine, I realized that we weren't alone. We had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to make the impossible possible. That night, we stood together, facing the world that had tried to tear us apart. We were no longer pretending to be something we weren't. We weren't hiding in the shadows or sneaking around in fear of judgment. We were out in the open, vulnerable, but proud. And as I kissed him under the streetlights, the kind of kiss that had no room for doubt or fear, I knew we had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a declaration. This was who we were. This was our story. And no matter what came next, I knew one thing for sure: our love, no matter how difficult or messy, was something beautiful, something worth fighting for.